Before anyone fired a single shot, before the first tank rolled across a border, the money was already there. Hidden, invisible, growing. 1933. Germany was finished. 6 million people are without work. Factories are empty. The government legally barred from borrowing more than 100 million Reichsmarks from its own central bank. International loans? Forget it. Nobody would lend to a country drowning in debt from a war it lost 15 years earlier. And yet, 6 years later, Germany had the second most powerful military on earth. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks, aircraft, submarines, a war machine that would soon conquer most of Europe. Here's what nobody understood at the time. This wasn't a miracle. This was accounting fraud on a scale the world had never seen. A financial trick so clever, so completely hidden, that even Germany's own people didn't know they were paying for it. A scheme that would make billions appear from thin air, fuel the fastest military build-up in modern history, and then vanish without a trace, leaving behind only ash and ruin. This is the story of how you fund a war when you have no money, when the entire world is watching, when every regulation, every treaty, every international agreement says you can't. This is the story of the Mefo Bills. And the man who invented them knew exactly what he was doing. How do you pay for a war machine when you're broke? That's the question that haunted Germany in early 1933. Because the problem wasn't just that Germany was poor. The problem was that Germany's poverty was built into the system, locked in place by treaties, monitored by foreign powers, enforced by its own laws. Let's be clear about where Germany stood. The Great Depression had hit this country harder than almost anywhere else on Earth. By early 33, unemployment wasn't just high, it was catastrophic. Almost 30% of the workforce, 6 million human beings with no jobs, no prospects, no hope. In some industrial cities, nearly half the population was out of work. But Germany's economic crisis didn't start in 1929. It started in 1919, with a peace treaty signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. That treaty did more than end World War I. It attempted to financially destroy Germany, strip away 13% of its territory, including some of its richest industrial regions, eliminate its military, hand over its colonies, and then, on top of all that, force it to pay reparations. Not just reparations for damage, reparations for the entire cost of the war, 132 billion gold marks. At the time, roughly 33 billion US dollars. In today's money, over 600 billion. Germany couldn't pay. The numbers didn't work. The country had financed World War I almost entirely on credit, expecting to win and make the losers pay for it. When Germany lost instead, it was left with a mountain of internal debt and now faced crushing external obligations. By 1923, the situation had become so desperate that France and Belgium actually invaded the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, trying to extract payment by force. That invasion triggered hyperinflation. By November of 23, 42 billion marks were worth 1 American cent. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than buying coal. Savings evaporated overnight. The middle class was wiped out. They eventually stabilized the currency, but the damage was done, and the reparations kept coming. The Dawes Plan in 24, the Young Plan in 29, restructuring, rescheduling, but never cancelling. Germany was trapped in a cycle where it borrowed money from American banks to pay reparations to France and Britain, who then used that money to pay war debts to America. It was a circular nightmare. And then came October 1929. Wall Street collapsed. American loans stopped flowing. Without those loans, Germany couldn't pay reparations. Without reparations, France and Britain couldn't pay their debts. The entire system seized up. And Germany, heavily dependent on American capital, went into free fall. Industrial production collapsed. By 1932, it had dropped to barely half of what it was in 28. Unemployment exploded, banks failed, businesses shuttered, hunger and desperation spread through German cities like a plague. This was the country Adolf Hitler inherited when he became Chancellor in January 1933. Broken, humiliated, financially devastated. And yet Hitler had made a promise. 4 years. Give me 4 years, he said, and I'll end unemployment. Give me 4 years, and I'll restore Germany's pride. But there was another promise, one he didn't say out loud, one that would require an enormous amount of money. He was going to rearm Germany, violate the Treaty of Versailles, and build a military powerful enough to dominate Europe. And he was going to do it in secret, in a country where the government was legally prohibited from borrowing enough money to make it happen. So how do you solve that problem? You find a magician, a financial wizard who can make money appear without anyone noticing. And in 1933, there was only one man in Germany clever enough, ruthless enough, and ambitious enough to pull it off. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. Even his name was unusual. Born in 1877, he'd been named after an American newspaper editor his father admired. He spoke multiple languages, studied in Berlin and Paris, and by his early 30s was already working in the highest levels of German finance. Schacht's claim to fame came in 1923, when Germany was drowning in hyperinflation. As currency commissioner and then president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, he was one of the architects of a new currency, the Rentenmark, that stopped the bleeding. It was a brilliant move. Stabilizing a currency in the middle of hyperinflation required not just technical skill, but psychological mastery. You had to convince people, both at home and abroad, that this new money was real, that it had value, that they could trust it. Schacht pulled it off. He became a national hero, a financial genius, the man who saved Germany from economic collapse. But Schacht had a problem. He was brilliant, but he had no political power. And in the chaos of Weimar Germany, technical competence wasn't enough. The government was weak, divided, ineffective. Schacht watched with growing frustration as politicians fumbled through crisis after crisis. He resigned from the Reichsbank in 1930, disgusted by the government's handling of reparations. And then he started looking for someone who could actually get things done, someone with vision, someone willing to break rules. He found Hitler. Schacht didn't join the Nazi party. He never wore a uniform, never shouted slogans at rallies. But he understood what Hitler represented. Power, certainty, the willingness to do whatever it took. In November 1932, Schacht organized a petition signed by Germany's leading industrialists and financiers, begging President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. When Hitler took power in January 1933, one of his first moves was to reappoint Schacht as president of the Reichsbank. By August 1934, Schacht was also Minister of Economics. He now controlled both Germany's central bank and its economic policy. He was, effectively, the second most powerful man in Germany, and Hitler had given him a mission. Rebuild Germany's military, do it quickly, do it secretly, and do it without triggering inflation, international sanctions, or domestic unrest. Schacht got to work immediately. But he faced enormous obstacles. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly banned German rearmament. The country was being watched. Foreign observers, diplomats, journalists. Everyone wanted to make sure Germany stayed weak. On top of that, Germany had almost no foreign currency reserves. It couldn't buy raw materials from abroad without revealing what it was building. And domestic production capacity was still recovering from the Depression. Worst of all, there was a legal problem. The Reichsbank, by law, could only lend the government 100 million Reichsmarks. That was pocket change. Nowhere near enough to build a military. If Schacht tried to lend more, it would be illegal. It would be visible in the government's budget. Foreign powers would see it immediately. So Schacht needed a way to create money that didn't look like money. A way to finance rearmament that wouldn't show up in the budget. A way to hide billions in spending in plain sight. He needed a ghost company. May 1933, just 4 months after Hitler took power. Schacht created a company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, Metallurgical Research Corporation, Mefo for short. On paper, Mefo looked legitimate. It had shareholders, 4 of Germany's biggest industrial companies, Krupp, Siemens, Gute Hoffnungshütte, and Rheinmetall. They each put up a small amount of capital, 250,000 Reichsmarks total. Nothing suspicious, just another corporation. But Mefo didn't do any research. It didn't manufacture anything. It had no employees, no factory, no office. It existed only on paper. Its address was a mailbox. It was a shell, a phantom. What Mefo did have were 2 directors, one appointed by the Ministry of Defense, one appointed by the Reichsbank. both working directly for Schacht. Here's how it worked. When the German government wanted to buy weapons, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, it would place an order with a company like Krupp. But instead of paying Krupp with Reichsmarks from the government budget, which would be visible and illegal, the government would issue a Mefo bill, a promissory note drawn on this fake company. The bill said, essentially, Mefo owes you this much money. It's good for 6 months. It pays 4% interest. The company receiving the bill, say Krupp, could do several things with it. They could hold on to it and collect interest. They could use it to pay their own suppliers, passing it along like cash. Or they could take it to any German bank and exchange it for actual Reichsmarks. And here's the key. The banks knew that the Reichsbank, controlled by Schacht, would always accept these bills. Always, without question, which meant Mefo bills were, effectively, money, secret money, money that didn't appear in the government budget, money that didn't count against the legal lending limit. It was brilliant, and it was completely fraudulent. Think about what Schacht had created, a way for the government to spend billions without it showing up anywhere. The Mefo bills circulated through the economy like real currency, but they weren't Reichsmarks. They weren't official debt. They were off the books, invisible. Foreign observers looking at Germany's budget saw nothing unusual. The official national debt looked manageable, but underneath, hidden from view, the Mefo system was creating a shadow economy, a secret mountain of debt that would eventually have to be paid. Between 1934 and 36, Mefo bills financed about 50% of all German weapons purchases. Think about that. Half of Germany's entire rearmament program was paid for with fake money created by a company that didn't exist. By 1938, there were 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of Mefo bills in circulation. To put that in perspective, Germany's official national debt in 32, before Hitler took power, was only 10 billion marks. By 38, the official admitted debt was 19 billion. But if you added the 12 billion in Mefo bills, the real debt was 31 billion. Hitler and Schacht had tripled Germany's national debt in just 6 years, and more than half of that increase was completely hidden. The system worked because everyone involved had a reason to stay quiet. The armament companies loved it. They got paid immediately, they could use the bills like cash, and they earned interest. The banks loved it. They made money processing the bills, and they knew the Reichsbank would back them. The Nazi government loved it because they could rearm in secret, and the German people had no idea it was happening. But there was a problem, a fundamental flaw in the system, one that Schacht understood from the beginning but chose to ignore. The bills were supposed to mature after 6 months. That meant whoever held them could demand payment in actual Reichsmarks after 6 months. But if everyone tried to cash in their Mefo bills at once, the Reichsbank would have to print massive amounts of money, which would cause hyperinflation. The nightmare of 1923 all over again. So Schacht did something brilliant and terrifying. He kept extending the maturity date. Every time a bill came due, he'd extend it by 90 days, then extend it again, then again. By 1939, the maturity period for Mefo bills had been stretched to 5 years. 5 years. The bills were supposed to be short-term notes. Instead, they'd become long-term bonds. Except nobody called them that, because calling them bonds would mean admitting they were government debt. This created a ticking time bomb, because eventually, those bills would come due. And when they did, Germany would face a choice: print money and risk hyperinflation, or default and admit the entire system was a fraud. Schacht knew this. He knew the system couldn't last forever. But he also knew that Hitler didn't care about forever. Hitler cared about now, about building an army fast enough to strike before anyone could stop him. And it worked. Between 33 and 39, German unemployment fell from 6 million to under 1 million. Factories roared back to life. Steel production soared. German shipyards launched submarines. Aircraft factories churned out fighters and bombers. Tank production ramped up. By 1939, Germany had an army of 91 divisions. Almost 4 million men under arms, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. A military that was, on paper, one of the most powerful in the world. All of it financed by Mefo bills, all of it built on a lie. But by 1936, cracks were starting to show. The economy was overheating. Raw material shortages were becoming critical. Germany didn't have enough iron ore, enough oil, enough rubber. Schacht's solution? A new plan. He tried to control imports and focus on domestic production, but it wasn't enough. The rearmament program was consuming everything. There wasn't enough for civilian goods. Consumer goods became scarce. Prices started rising. Hitler didn't care. In August 1936, he issued a secret memorandum outlining a new 4-year plan. The goal: make Germany completely self-sufficient and ready for war within 4 years. He put Hermann Göring in charge. Göring, who knew nothing about economics, but understood Hitler's priorities perfectly: rearmament at any cost. This put Schacht in an impossible position. He'd created a system to hide rearmament, but now Hitler wanted to accelerate it beyond what the economy could support. Schacht pushed back. He warned that they were heading toward financial collapse, that the debt was unsustainable, that continuing to print Mefo Bills would eventually cause inflation. Hitler ignored him. Göring ignored him. They didn't care about sustainability. They cared about being ready for war, and they were willing to sacrifice everything, including the economy, to make it happen. Here's what almost nobody understood at the time. The Mefo Bills weren't just a clever accounting trick. They were a weapon, a financial weapon that allowed Germany to do something unprecedented: arm for war in total secrecy while appearing to follow the rules. Every other country could see Germany's official budget. They could monitor its gold reserves, its currency, its national debt. But they couldn't see the Mefo Bills because the Mefo Bills existed in a shadow system. They looked like commercial paper, like ordinary business transactions. Foreign intelligence agencies didn't even know to look for them. This gave Germany an enormous strategic advantage. While Britain and France were debating whether to rearm, whether they could afford it, whether the public would support it, Germany was already doing it, massively, in complete secrecy. But here's the dark secret at the heart of the system. The Mefo Bills weren't just hidden from foreign observers. They were hidden from the German people too. German citizens had no idea how much their government was spending. No idea how much debt was being created in their name. No idea that their economy was being restructured entirely around preparation for war. And Schacht knew this. He knew the bills would eventually come due. He knew the system would collapse. His plan, apparently, was to get Germany to full employment, stimulate enough industrial production, and then shut the system down before it exploded. But by 1938, it was too late. The first Mefo Bills, issued in 1933 with a 5-year guarantee, were about to mature. 12 billion marks worth of paper was coming due, and Germany didn't have the money to pay it. The government had 3 options: default and admit the fraud, print money and trigger hyperinflation, or force someone else to pay. They chose option 3. The Nazi government went to the banks and said, "You're buying government bonds, not optional." Forced purchases. They raided savings accounts. They seized money from insurance companies. They turned ordinary German citizens into the unwitting financiers of Germany's war machine. People who'd put money aside for retirement, for their children's education, for emergencies, suddenly found that money was gone. Converted into government bonds that paid almost nothing and would likely never be repaid. This was theft. Legal, authorized, systematized theft. The government was seizing private wealth to pay for bills that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And still, it wasn't enough. By late 1938, Schacht could see the end coming. The economy was running on fumes. The Mefo system was breaking down. Inflation was starting to creep up. If this continued, Germany would be right back where it started in 1923. Hyperinflation, economic collapse, chaos. In December 1938, Schacht refused a routine end-of-month loan to the government. It was a small amount, but it was a signal, a line in the sand. He was done. In January 1939, he and the other directors of the Reichsbank wrote a memo to Hitler. 8 men signed it. The memo warned that Germany was on the edge of financial disaster, that continued deficit spending would destroy the currency, that the government needed to cut military expenditures immediately. Hitler's response was simple. On January 19, 1939, he he fired Schacht as president of the Reichsbank. The man who'd created the entire system, the financial wizard who'd made the impossible possible, was out. Hitler replaced him with Walther Funk, a party loyalist who would do whatever he was told. Schacht stayed on as minister without portfolio, a meaningless title. He still collected his salary, but he had no power, no influence. He'd built a machine and now that machine was out of control. The Mefo system didn't end when Schacht left, it metastasized. Without Schacht's restraint, without anyone who understood the dangers, the Nazi government just kept printing. They printed regular government bonds, they printed short-term notes, they seized foreign currency, they looted occupied territories, they stole gold from central banks, from private citizens, from anyone they could. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, it did so with an economy that was already bankrupt. The military was powerful, yes, highly trained, well-equipped. But it was built on a foundation of sand. Germany couldn't sustain a long war. It didn't have the resources. It didn't have the money. The entire strategy depended on quick victories. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, strike fast, win fast, loot the conquered territories to pay for the next attack. It worked, for a while. Germany conquered Poland in weeks. Denmark and Norway in months. France, Belgium, the Netherlands all fell in a matter of weeks. Each victory brought new resources. Seized factories, captured weapons, confiscated gold. The German war machine fed on conquest. But the fundamental problem never went away. Germany's economy was a Ponzi scheme. It only worked if it kept expanding. If the conquest stopped, if the loot ran out, the whole thing would collapse. And that's exactly what happened. When Germany failed to defeat Britain in 1940, when it invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and got bogged down in a war of attrition, when the United States entered the war in 1941 and tipped the balance of industrial production decisively against Germany, by 1942, the cracks were showing. German weapons production was impressive, but it couldn't match the combined output of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Those countries had sustainable economies. They could borrow, tax, print money without destroying their currencies because they had real productive capacity backing it up. Germany had a shell game, an illusion, and illusions don't win wars. Albert Speer, who took over war production in 1942, managed to increase output dramatically through sheer ruthlessness. Forced labor, slave labor, looting occupied territories down to the bare walls. But even that wasn't enough. Germany ran out of everything. Oil, rubber, metal, food. By 1945, German soldiers were fighting with weapons that barely worked, burning synthetic fuel that destroyed engines, eating rations that weren't enough to keep them alive. The Mefo Bills? Long forgotten. Worthless. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, the Reichsmark collapsed with it. All those bills, all that hidden debt, all those bonds that German citizens had been forced to buy turned to ash. People lost everything. Again, just like in 1923. But this time it was worse. This time the entire country was destroyed. Schacht survived the war. He was arrested by the Gestapo in July 1944 after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler. They thought he might have been involved. He spent the last months of the war in concentration camps. When the Allies liberated Germany, they put him on trial at Nuremberg, charged with planning and financing aggressive war. The prosecutors had evidence. Documents showing Schacht had created the Mefo system specifically to hide rearmament. Testimony showing he'd known it was illegal. Records showing he'd helped Hitler prepare for war. But Schacht had a defense. He argued that he'd tried to stop it, that he'd warned Hitler the system was unsustainable, that he'd been fired for refusing to continue, and technically, legally, he had a point. He hadn't planned the invasions. He'd just made them financially possible. The judges at Nuremberg debated for months. In the end, they acquitted him. Not because they thought he was innocent, but because they couldn't prove he'd intended to commit crimes against peace. Creating a financial system that enabled war wasn't the same as planning war. At least that's what they decided. Schacht walked free. Later, a German denazification court tried him again and sentenced him to 8 years in a labor camp. He served a couple of years, then was released. He lived until 1970, 93 years old. He wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, insisted until the end that he'd been trying to save Germany, not destroy it. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he convinced himself that his intentions were pure, that he was just a technician, a financial expert doing his job. But the truth is simpler and darker. Schacht created a system that allowed a genocidal dictatorship to build a war machine in secret. He knew what he was doing. He knew where it would lead. And he did it anyway, because he was brilliant and ambitious, and he wanted to be part of something powerful. Here's what matters today. The Mefo Bills weren't the last time a government hid the true cost of war. Think about how modern conflicts are financed. Think about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For years, the United States didn't include war spending in the regular federal budget. It was funded through emergency supplemental appropriations, special bills passed outside the normal budgeting process, off-budget spending, just like Mefo Bills. Why? Same reason. Political cover. If you put war spending in the regular budget, people see it. They see how much it costs. They see what you're not spending on because you're spending on war. They ask questions. But if you fund it separately, through emergency bills, through supplemental appropriations, it looks like a one-time thing, temporary, not part of the permanent structure. It's the same trick, different mechanism, same principle. Hide the true cost so people don't object. Or think about how countries manage their debt. Officially, the United States has a debt ceiling, a legal limit on how much the government can borrow. Sounds responsible, right? Except the debt ceiling gets raised constantly. It's political theatre. The limit exists, but it doesn't actually limit anything. Just like the Reichsbank's 100 million mark lending limit. The law said Schacht couldn't lend more. So he found a way to lend more without calling it a loan. Today we have special purpose vehicles, off-balance sheet financing, public-private partnerships, contingent liabilities. All of these are ways governments hide debt. They borrow money without officially borrowing it. They create obligations without putting them in the budget. Mefo Bills in modern dress. Russia's war in Ukraine. There's evidence that Russia is using state-owned enterprises to finance war spending. Companies like Gazprom taking on debt that doesn't show up in the government budget. Banks extending credit to defense contractors that should be unbankable risks. Why would banks do that? Because they know the government will bail them out. It's an implicit guarantee. Off-budget financing. China's Belt and Road Initiative. Officially, it's infrastructure investment. But look closer. Many of those loans are never going to be repaid. They're creating dependencies, strategic leverage, political control. It's not on China's government balance sheet, but it's a form of power projection that costs money. Hidden costs, future obligations that don't appear in official debt figures. The European Union has similar issues. During the debt crisis of 2010 to 2012, the EU created emergency mechanisms to bail out countries. The European Stability Mechanism, the European Financial Stability Facility. These entities issued bonds backed by EU countries, but those obligations didn't show up on individual countries' debt figures. Off-balance sheet, hidden from view. Even in peacetime, governments play these games. Social Security in the United States is technically off-budget. The trust fund holds government bonds, but those bonds are just IOUs from one part of the government to another. Future taxpayers will have to pay those obligations, but they don't count as part of the official national debt. It's accounting fiction. The liabilities are real, but we pretend they're not. This matters because it affects how we make decisions. If citizens knew the true cost of war, if they saw the real size of government obligations, they might make different choices. They might demand different priorities. But when the costs are hidden, when the debt is off the books, it's easier for governments to do things that would be politically impossible if done openly. The Mefo Bills showed that you can hide enormous costs if you're clever enough. And that trick has been copied, refined, and institutionalized in modern finance. We live in a world where governments routinely use accounting tricks to hide what they're spending and what they owe. Not because the money isn't real, but because if people saw the real numbers, they might object. But here's the part almost nobody talks about, the part that even historians sometimes miss. The Mefo Bills didn't just hide the cost of rearmament. They fundamentally changed how Germany's economy worked. They created a system where the government, not the market, decided what got produced, where resources flowed not to whoever could pay the most, but to whoever had the right connections, where profit came not from efficiency or innovation, but from government contracts. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex. Not in the United States after World War II, in Germany in the 1930s. The armament companies that participated in the Mefo system got rich, not because they were good at business, because they were good at getting government money. Krupp, Siemens, IG Farben. These companies became massive, not through competition, but through guaranteed government contracts. And once you create that system, it's almost impossible to dismantle. The companies depend on government spending. The government depends on the companies to build weapons. Politicians depend on the companies for campaign support. Workers depend on the companies for jobs. It becomes self-perpetuating. Even Schacht, who created the system, couldn't stop it. Once the machine was running, it had its own momentum. That's why Schacht's resignation didn't matter. That's why firing him changed nothing. The system had taken on a life of its own. The arms manufacturers wanted contracts. The military wanted weapons. The politicians wanted power. And all of them had convinced themselves they were serving the nation. This is the real danger of hidden war finance. It's not just that it hides the cost. It creates interests. Political interests, economic interests, bureaucratic interests. People and institutions that profit from war spending, who have every incentive to keep it going, to expand it, to make it permanent. That's what happened in Germany. The Mefo Bills started as a way to rebuild the military, but they created a class of people, companies, and institutions whose wealth and power depended on continued military spending. Even if Hitler had been rational, even if he'd wanted to stop after making Germany strong enough to deter attack, he probably couldn't have. Too many people had too much invested in the system continuing, and that's what we see today. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Is that because of genuine security needs, or because defense contractors employ millions of people in every congressional district, making it politically impossible to cut spending? When a weapons program fails, when a project goes over budget, when an audit shows waste, does anything change? Or do the contracts keep flowing because too many people depend on them? The Mefo Bills showed us how easy it is to create a system where war becomes profitable, where the machinery of violence becomes self-sustaining, where the people who should be questioning the costs are the very people who benefit from them continuing. Schacht thought he was being clever. He thought he could control it. Turn it on, get what Germany needed, then turn it off. But he was wrong. Once you create a system that profits from preparation for war, that system fights to survive. It finds new enemies, new threats, new reasons to keep going. It doesn't matter what you intended. It matters what you built. And what Schacht built was a machine that could only be fed. That demanded more money, more resources, more production. And when Germany ran out of money at home, the machine demanded that Germany take it from somewhere else. Conquest wasn't just about ideology or revenge or living space. It was about feeding the machine, keeping the system going, finding new sources of wealth to loot because the domestic economy couldn't sustain what had been built. This is the hidden cost of hidden finance. Not just the money that disappears, but the system that emerges, the incentives that align, the institutions that grow powerful, the interests that become impossible to dislodge. Germany's war machine destroyed Germany, but the model survived. The idea that you can hide the cost of war, that you can build a military-industrial system funded by secret debt, that you can make war preparation profitable for the right people, that model didn't die in 1945. It mutated, it evolved, it spread, and we're living with it now. This was not just a story about accounting fraud. This was not just about one clever man finding a loophole in financial regulations. This was the story of how nations convince themselves they can afford war, how they hide the cost from their own people, how they build systems that make war not just possible, but profitable. Hjalmar Schacht created the Mefo Bills because he was a genius, and because he believed Germany needed a strong military, and because he thought he could manage the consequences. He was right about the first two, dead wrong about the third. The consequences were catastrophic, not just for Germany's enemies, but for Germany itself. millions dead, cities reduced to rubble, a currency destroyed, an economy shattered, a nation divided and occupied for half a century, and the Mefo Bills. They were the seed of all of it. Not the cause of the war, but the mechanism that made it possible. The hidden machine that turned desperation into armament, poverty into power, accounting tricks into armies. We remember World War II for the battles, the invasions, the bombings. We should also remember it for the balance sheets, for the hidden debt that made it all possible, for the financial fraud that armed a dictatorship, because that lesson is more relevant now than ever. In a world where governments routinely hide debt, where war spending happens off budget, where the costs of military action are transferred to future generations through borrowing, where defense contractors profit regardless of whether there's a war, we need to understand what Schacht taught us. You can hide the cost of war. You can make it invisible. You can create systems that allow nations to arm without their people knowing the price, but you can't hide the consequences. The debt comes due. The systems you create outlive your intentions. The machine you build eventually controls you. Schacht lived to be 93. He died in his sleep, comfortable, surrounded by family. The millions who died because of what he built weren't so lucky. The German citizens who lost everything twice in one generation weren't so lucky. The countries conquered by armies paid for with phantom money weren't so lucky. His bills matured. His scheme collapsed. His machine destroyed itself and everything around it. But the idea survived. The idea that you can make war from nothing, that you can conjure armies from clever accounting, that you can hide the cost until it's too late to stop. We still live inside that idea today. Every time a government hides military spending off budget, every time a war is financed with debt instead of taxes, every time the true cost of conflict is obscured by financial engineering, we're using Schacht's playbook. We're building Mefo systems. We're hiding war behind accounting tricks. The only question is whether we'll learn the lesson before those bills come due. If you want to understand how this pattern repeats in modern conflicts, how today's wars are financed with the same hidden mechanisms, watch the next video in this series. We're going deep into the financial architecture of modern warfare. If you value this kind of historical analysis, if you want to see through the accounting tricks that governments use to hide the cost of war, consider subscribing, like the video and share. The next story is already waiting, and it connects directly to the world you're living in right now. Thanks for watching.